All right.
Okay, we're all set? Good. Okay, great. Hey, everyone. I'm sorry for the delay, but we're about to get started here. So welcome to City Forum. I'm Alex Carner, Associate Professor in Community and Regional Planning and the Faculty Director for City Forum this year. And just thanks, as always, to Matthew, my GRA, and to Cole and Keith for their outstanding technical support. So today to City Forum, we welcome Carmen Llanes Pulido, who's the Executive Director of Go Austin, Vamos Austin, or GAVA. Carmen is a native Austinite and second-generation community organizer with over 15 years of experience in environmental justice organizing, public health, racial and economic justice, and leadership development. Before GAVA, she co-created and managed an evidence-based program at Marathon Kids in collaboration with Sustainable Food Center that engaged parents, teachers, and local churches at 18 public elementary schools in the Eastern Crescent to improve nutrition and fitness options. And prior to that, Carmen worked as a research analyst and organizer with Poder in East Austin. Carmen also currently serves on City of Austin Planning Commission. She previously chaired the Hispanic and Latino Quality of Life Commission. In 2013, she served on the inaugural Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, which drew maps for Austin's first geographically representative city council. So tons of great local experience in Austin. Today, she'll be talking about GAVA's work to realize equitable community planning and decision-making. And importantly, she'll help us think through root causes driving the many challenges facing our city and region, and give us a sense of how community engagement and organizing can help guide us towards more equitable solutions. So with that, we'll welcome Carmen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to test my projection skills. So in the back, see, I got a nod from this guy. So you're going to be the one I look to. If anybody else can't hear, just do one of these. I'm the daughter of performers. I'm an Austin kid, so I'm very used to the stagehand signals. Thank you so much for that thoughtful introduction. I am a local. I've been pretty involved in a lot of different community work for a long time, and I believe I was asked to come here because we've had some great partnerships. I say we, GAVA, when I worked with Poder, we did a lot of work with the University of Texas, Marathon Kids too, with the School of Public Health in particular. But the School of Architecture has been a really creative partner. And the school is a school, but the people at the School of Architecture, and I particularly want to shout out Bjorn Sleto, who you will see in pictures here. He's kind of a celebrity, one of those people who's just really good at finding a human connection in almost every place he goes, in my opinion. And I got to know him actually when I was at Poder, I think back in 2007, maybe 8. He was doing a project with his class, actually using GIS mapping to show how children at Zavala Elementary were altering their routes to school because of the metal foundry across the street. So using really easy for children descriptors like things are bad, or they smell bad, or it's scary, or it's loud, actually mapping those experiences and the way that they were changing routes. And that became data and visuals for city council presentations. Peer casting has since closed. It is now out of the community. It's great. Wish it was more deeply affordable housing, but that's another story. We'll get to that. So, and I bring that up because at that time, Austin is quite a segregated city in a lot of ways, and in some ways it's a very mixed up city. And in other ways, it gets increasingly stark, right? The two Austins used to be a lot about each side of 35, and we see it more and more in economic segregation, still economic racism, but more and more the economic divide in our city is so huge. But really, we didn't start having mainstream public conversations about racial equality and racial equity, more importantly, until I would say about 2013. So it's been less than a decade that those conversations have really been out in the open. So I can tell you, because he said it himself, Bjorn was warned about coming and talking to Poder. Getting these sort of warnings that Poder could be difficult, or insert coded language around discomfort, because this is a group that regularly publicly pointed to the legacy of environmental racism in Austin, why it was leading to the inequities we were seeing today. And of course, Bjorn, strolled right in and didn't find those problems, and was sort of embraced by the community and found a way to really bring his students in to do something very meaningful and useful. So I was thrilled a decade plus later when we got to collaborate again at GAVA, and you'll get to see a few pictures from that and hear a little bit about that. But I bring that up because It's such subjective stuff, right? And yet, when we look at racial equity and we look at history, we're looking at mathematical outcomes and we're looking at legal policy and letter of the law, right? But in between all of that is the human experience and where we all come from. And so what I want to capture today, which is like impossible because we have no time, we have a little time, precious time. I don't want to bore you to death. I don't want to overload you with information. I want to present a little bit of a landscape of here of like who lives in these neighborhoods. When we talk about community planning, who are we talking about? We're talking about all of us, where we live, our neighbors, who supports us, and maybe if we're living a more transient life as a student or as somebody who has to move around, our community changes, our support network changes, but these are still elements that are embedded in our human and built-in environment. And so I want to give you a little bit of the textures and contours of who people are, some of the lived history, and then I am going to talk about some of the icky stuff. I'm very passionate about land use, and I'm very saturated in city politics. I've never worked for the city of Austin, contrary to the beliefs of most of my family and friends, who all think I work for the city. I actually have been a city official in the commission role for the last 9.5 years. And those are volunteer roles. I served on the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, then Latino Quality of Life, and now Planning, which is one of our sovereign land use commissions. And our recommendations are official, and they go into city policy that amends our land development code. And it is a place I'm very passionate, even though it can be a very toxic landscape, because it is the single most powerful, influential role that our city government plays in terms of creating additional land or creating additional land potential and development potential, and also regulating the things that impact our quality of life, things directly tied to the infrastructure, to the green space, to the environment, the built-in environment. So what I've experienced is some incredible connections with a couple of professors here at the School of Architecture. I also have to shout out Catherine Liebernicht, who's doing amazing work with us on climate resilience. And has brought really awesome resources that we were actually able to pass the majority directly into the community, training people to do disaster preparedness in their communities with funding from the National Science Foundation. So super exciting. But unfortunately, there are these undercurrents. There's a huge real estate influence in Austin. Austin's a hot market, right? So everybody wants a slice of Austin, which means the demand for so-called housing as an investment, more so than just shelter, which everybody in this room, we all need, right? That demand is not the city of Austin. It's not even a 5-county area, which is typically what we look at our housing market. It's not even the state of Texas, which is sending people into Austin every day, or California. It's the whole world. It is every investor looking at real estate worldwide. So that's an enormously difficult conundrum we have with these conflated investment and housing markets. And what it means is that market-based solutions, laissez-faire, or as they go, as the money flows, is going to disproportionately hurt the people who have always been hurt in market-driven solutions, right? So that's why we're a big stick in the mud in a lot of these conversations about Austin's land development code and upzoning, and I couldn't be here at the School of Architecture without touching on that, even though I do want to fill everyone's hearts and minds with these beautiful positive images about healthy food and playgrounds and physical activity, because all those things are fun and games and meaningful and beautiful and quality of life. But what it comes down to is sharing those health outcomes with the communities who worked so hard to build them, and being able to build the relationships and the stuff of life, to be able to enjoy it and not just get pushed to the wayside. So can I click here? Oops, that's a left. See, you can tell I'm a Mac user. Tisk. Lots of words. You can always go back and visit this. I'll go quickly here, but our mission is really to organize and mobilize community power for health equity. Our vision is a health equity vision, which means that we started as a place-based childhood obesity initiative. Actually, not everybody knows that. We were started by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation in Dove Springs because of the very high childhood obesity rates, and wanting to look a little upstream at how easy it is to access healthy food and physical activity, and working with the community to create those changes, right? So the idea was like, your zip code very easily determines your outcomes in life, your health, your lifespan, right? So our health equity vision is when we can no longer predict your health outcomes by your zip code, but not just your zip code, because you might have just moved to that zip code from a fancy place. We don't even know, right? But we want race to no longer be the #1 indicator of health outcomes in this country. It's still #1. Why so much about race as a primary axis? Because it is still the most reliable indicator of health outcomes in this country. Income, of course, being huge and intertwined with that, right? But your education level, your immigration status, your primary language, et cetera, we want a world where those things can't be used as predictors of your health outcomes. And so we are applying the same methodology that we applied for years, and we're able to prove out building leadership and networks, partnerships, funding, policy, et cetera, to increase access to healthy living. And we want people to be able to stay. So we started talking about salud y permanencia in the last 5-6 years. Were your ears burning down the hall, Bjorn? Because I already talked about you. Here we go, left click again. So it's interesting, right? Because I mentioned we started as a childhood obesity intervention, and several years into our work, we proved out some great health outcomes. Guess what? Yes, if they build it, they will come. If the people have a part in driving a community master plan to improve a park, or to bring in culturally relevant foods, or instead of trying to get all of the people who aren't usually represented at the farmer's market across town to a place that's really not necessarily economically, geographically, or culturally accessible, having resident-led farm stands that were in apartments and schools. Now we've taken that actually a step further to a resident-led produce distribution that started during the pandemic in April of 2020, where residents are actually delivering Urban Roots produce in a pay-what-you-can model to households all over North and South Austin. So, childhood obesity, yes. Did we solve the childhood obesity crisis? No. We were able to make some really significant changes in accessibility, in even health behaviors, and we even stabilized adult BMIs among those who were highly exposed to our efforts, which is a really big deal. Now, body mass index, it's not really used very much anymore. It's kind of frowned upon even in the public health world, but it was still very prominent at that time and in our evaluations. It was a big deal because we weren't measuring people's food or prescribing individual fitness programs, right? We weren't working with people's doctors or community health workers. This was all at the population level. So park improvements, lighting, pedestrian infrastructure, meal plans at schools, et cetera. So really, we're working on much more than obesity. We're really working on the social determinants of health. Big buzzword now, and I think this one's even getting phased out. It's like had the end of its 10 years, and I think it's something else now. People started saying structural determinants of health, and now I'm hearing this is even trying to get replaced. But that's what happens every 10 or so years in cross-sector academics and philanthropy. There's always like a buzzword, and then it becomes a different thing. But we're almost always coming back to the collective of what community are we in, right? What is our access to resources, networks, relationships? So the social determinants, basically, this is the concept that 80 to 90% of what determines your health outcomes is outside of the doctor's office. So separate from the medical care that you're getting, because oftentimes when we hear health, we think health care, doctors, nurses, health insurance, uninsured, insured, underinsured, et cetera. But really 80% of what's determining your health outcomes, according to the research, is really more about the zip code you live in, the family ties that you have, your relationship to racism and colonialism, colonization, the language access you have, your interactions with the criminal justice system, the educational system, the education and habits that you build before the age of 5, from 0 to 5, right? So early childhood is a big part of what we work on. So really, this is about where you live, learn, work, play, and worship. The first place I heard that frame was the environmental justice movement. So the environmental justice movement was about redefining the environment from being separate from human beings to being the environment in which we all live, work, learn, play, and pray. So it's nothing new, but it has been kind of refurbished, and it's now a major interest of some of our healthcare systems. Please forgive the salmon font if that's difficult to read, but you never know how this is going to look on the big screen until you see it. So I did mention in my abstract, I wanted to talk about why blanket zoning as a particular concept, I know this feels like we're here on the balcony, but I'm gonna rein in on this one piece, why it can be so harmful. We've seen it in East Austin. There are many examples that I could point to you. They don't just start with the 1928 plan. Much of the toxic industry that came into East Austin came in the 50s in industrial overlays. They're parallel to other forms of racism and economic segregation in the school districts, et cetera. But if we were just to look at Southeast Austin and even North Central, where GAVA is working now, a couple decades later, the places we see disproportionate chronic disease and some of those built-in environment issues, we're also seeing now the climate crisis come to a head. Heat and flooding, right? The two biggest, most present climate shocks and stressors that are hitting us all over the world. But we're really seeing it here, right? And in some of our neighborhoods, this is not a future conversation, right? We're starting to hear that now that everybody's getting used to going into the Greek alphabet with hurricanes. Like, okay, climate change is no longer a future thing, right? It's here. But for these communities, particularly in Southeast Austin, because of inequities in land use and really problematic moves by FEMA, by developers in the 70s and 80s that put whole neighborhoods in harm's way, as well as, inequitable water management and land use that has exacerbated localized flooding, these folks are also most disproportionately impacted by flooding. And in North Austin, and parts of Southeast Austin as well, where there's not a lot of green space, where there's tons of impervious cover, and a lot has been built out without really adequate balance like you see in a lot of the rest of the city, the heat is extreme. There is major urban heat island effect and restricted mobility because it's very difficult, especially if you don't have a car. It's almost lethal to try to walk certain places in the heat, right? So this is stuff that's kind of now expanding our networks even internationally. My colleague Francis Acuna got to go to DC recently with Catherine Lieberknecht and got to meet people from all over the world and country and was like, wow, we're in this together. We're dealing with these issues everywhere. But because of all these different sort of combining structural inequities, we're really seeing disparate impact in particular places. And I wanted to share this just really quick. Y'all can go to our website on GAVA's policy priorities to read some of the policy papers we've created over the years. This was particularly an Eastern Crescent people's sort of white paper that we put out in response to the Soifer ruling, which is what halted the city of Austin from redoing the land development code. And I could talk about this for hours, and I won't. But there are a couple of different things that we addressed, in particular, the climate shocks and stressors, and also the gentrification and displacement, and really like who is benefiting from what. So unfortunately what we saw, it's not to say our land code doesn't need changes, believe me. It's also untrue to say that our land code hasn't changed since 1984, because actually it changes every week when council amends it. My dad lives in the epicenter of gentrification in one of the fastest changing parts of 78702 over the last 10, 20 years. And what doesn't get talked about a lot is that their neighborhood plan, which was essential in downzoning industrial toxic areas after the tank farms were kicked out in the 90s, is that neighborhood plan has 38 win-win amendments where developers and community were actually able to negotiate something they could all live with. So they've accommodated thousands of new units. And so when people say the land development code is broken, for them, they're going, ours isn't broken. We may need a few more tweaks and options, but we actually have bargaining chips at the table with developers to negotiate more community benefit, including affordable housing, including green space, right? So this has been a really big fight, right? Another point that we brought up is that code is not planning. I actually got this from a professionally trained planner. So I like to verbally plagiarize a lot of things that bureaucrats tell me and they can't say out loud in the public, but then they give me permission to say it. But the reality is that Code Next, as an $8.5 million failure, it's shelved, right? And then the ensuing LDC rewrites, they were trying to plan with code. So they're coming to community with a 1,600 page document. And then some people would say, well, is there language access? We should be translating this to Spanish. And some of us went, no, don't translate this 1,600-page document into Spanish. You're going to waste time. Who wants to read this? It's code. And it's a hybrid. Some of it's like our existing code. Some of it's new terms. Every time the politics gets weird, they change the terms, right? They're transition zones and then residential zones and RM1 and TD this and that. And it gets very confusing. And so really, the successful way to do things is to create a community plan and then write a code that supports that. But it takes more time, it takes more nuance, and some of the projects I'm really proud to have gotten to work on, they do some of that. Let me see, how can I maximize this again?
Hit F11.
Oh, oh right. Keyboard shortcuts. Okay, so. Direct the writer it should be in quotes. That's a term from a book called Switch, which is about motivating people to do difficult things together. But I wanted to mention one of those particular cases in the Go Valley Johnston Terrace neighborhood, which this is not in GAVA areas. This is my dad's neighborhood, which I'm just throwing out stuff like 1928 and the tank farms. Are y'all relatively familiar? Good, I see some nodding heads, old petroleum tanks that were in 52 acres across East Austin. And so not just the tanks, the metal foundry I was talking about earlier, the BFI recycling plant, Tri-Matheson gas, all these toxic industries and heavy industry. That plan was adopted in 2003, and it downzoned many of those properties to single-family residential. That does two things. It brings the zoning more into compatibility with the majority of what was around it, which is single-family. They did designate higher density corridors along Airport and 7th, but they want Cesar Chavez. So they're still coming for Cesar Chavez. But it said this is where we could guide a lot of growth, and we want to support these single family residences that have been burdened with this toxicity to have compatible neighborhood zoning around them. But what it also does is leaves that negotiation room, because that is the lowest intensity zoning. And lowest intensity zoning is oftentimes directly associated with land value through development potential. We got a lot of spinsters who will try to say that upzoning brings the price down, but actually upzoning increases land value. So while you may have more units sharing land value, your overall land value, what they're sharing the cost of, is going up. And oftentimes it's going up for an investor, not necessarily building equity or long-term affordability for the people in an area, unless you subsidize it and you really intentionally negotiate that upzoning. So Think East was an area of East Austin that after the tank farms were kicked out, by the way, I'll share a link, beautiful documentary piece that Watershed Protection did last year, actually captures the tank farm story in 4 or 5-minute documentary pieces, really, really nice summary of the people's movement that drove that. There was only one area that was cleaned up to residential standards. So everything else is cleaned up to commercial, but there's still groundwater contamination, there's still soil contamination in many places. So the only residential cleanup site was this property, this large property on Jane Lane, and the neighborhoods said to the developers who wanted a zoning change, do something big, they said, this is so valuable to us, we really need at least a fourth of this development to be dedicated to affordable housing. And for our communities, we're talking 0 to 60 MFI. We're not talking about this 60 to 80 or 80 to 120, because the median family incomes, as you'll see in that policy paper, are much lower in neighborhoods where people have been here, especially economically segregated areas, et cetera. So the developers were actually able to work out this deal with the community because the community brought in the Cesar Chavez Foundation. And the Cesar Chavez Foundation subsidized the project. So they were able to build a capital stack. It's called a capital stack. You get some soft money, people who don't want the money back, and then you have people who, they'll take the money back if you make the money, and then you have people who are like, I'll take 1 or 2% return, and you can stack that money with low-income housing tax credits, et cetera. Eventually you get to the people who are like, I want 4, I want 9%, I want a 12% return, right? They can get their money back, but you have all this stacked capital, and so you're able to actually create an affordable housing project. So that resulted, the developers were thrilled, by the way, because what happened? They have this big piece of property, they reserve a third, community asked for at least a fourth. They reserved a third for affordable housing. Well, it takes a while to execute these deals, right? So in 2, 3, 4 years, by the time they sell that to the affordable housing developer, which has acquired other funds to build, to acquire the land and buy, that value is appreciated tremendously. So the sale of that land for the affordable housing paid for 2/3 of the deals. I mean, one of these guys retired after Think East, okay? But the community got 300 income restricted units, which is really great. Now, if I told my friends in Oakland or Chicago or Denver about this, they'd be like, 30%? And I'd be like, you don't understand. We never get 30%. So this is the kind of project we want to see. And this was a PUD. This was a planned unit development. But this was a bright spot. It was a very, very meaningful project, and it is a great model. If it's done right, you can even have ownership and equity building. So these kinds of things, you know, how we negotiate for upzoning, there are lots of other things at the table. Our environmental regulations are being discussed right now by the council. Just went through Planning Commission. Once again, there is a big real estate interest to tie environmental regulations to upzoning. So like, oh, if we do all these environmental, it's going to make it too expensive for the developer. We have to make it less expensive for the developer. The thought being that the developer will pass on savings to us humble renters and buyers, which has another name. Actually, one of my fellow planning commissioners said it himself. It is a trickle-down theory. Anybody familiar with that term? All right, I don't mean to be so cheeky, but this is what I deal with on a regular basis. We have no empirical evidence to show that granting entitlements to developers is going to incentivize them to bring down prices. And we also don't have any reason to say that environmental regulations inherently make housing more expensive. That argument can be spun, but there's no guarantee to us that the cost savings come back to the community in any kind of way. And like it or not, we're an environmentally sensitive area. We're on the Balcones Escarpment and clay and all these different things, right? We're in the climate crisis. So there's some things that are just not negotiable, including mitigating some of our flooding risks. Increase something, I probably needed to put something in there, but affordable housing, public safety, transportation, utility. We do so many of these things through street impact fees and other ways that we're constantly trying to pay for the infrastructural needs of our city. We max out our credit card on bonds, and then we're incentivized as a city to have a wealthier tax base. So the market incentives for affordable housing as we need it don't exist. That's part of why it's cheaper for us to preserve what we have than to build more, even though we do need to build more. But it's going to have to probably be subsidized. So if we could really show the value of preserving existing single family and duplex. Now, let's talk about single family a little. I know it's been very heavily demonized in many housing, circles because it's not as efficient. But I want to challenge you to think about who lives in these places too, especially in Dove Springs. If you were to replace the large single family homes and duplexes with modern day what we're seeing in new fourplexes, there's talk about missing middle, but small units on small land is not really economically feasible. The big money is in maxing out FAR and building kind of luxury housing because we have luxury people moving in. So that market pressure means that you might actually put a fourplex somewhere and have fewer people living in that fourplex than the 2 or 3 families doubling up in that single family home and duplex, because where we're working, we got large families, working people, co-parenting situations, the people who are living there, if you're talking about, you might have more units, but have fewer people. So the kind of housing you're creating is really important. And the other piece is that single family and multifamily work together in an ecosystem. So take a neighborhood like Hyde Park. You have a number of apartment complexes that were built in the 60s and 70s before the 84 Land Development Code rewrite. 100% impervious cover, just mowed everything down, concrete parking lot, little apartment complex. What's around it? A whole bunch of beautiful heritage trees that are cared for by single family homeowners. In our neighborhoods of focus, up to 30% of the single family homes are actually renter occupied. And I can tell you anecdotally, many parents of young children I have known desperately happy when they can get out of an apartment complex and into a home they can rent, or a duplex they can rent, or a small complex they can rent, because they usually have a relationship with the landlord and they have a community around them. They have a school their kid can walk to, they have shaded streets, etc. So it's an ecosystem. It's not to say we need to build out more of any one particular type, but these are the nuances that you can get in community planning, where you see what you want more of and where. So yeah, there is a tremendous cost savings if you're actually looking for income restricted or more affordable housing. I'm not going to go into community land trusts and all that stuff, but what I will say, what I'm seeing in those of us who are really trying to push these pipelines for deeply affordable, permanently affordable housing and things like community land trusts, they're not moving at scale for the crisis. And politically, that is putting pressure to invest in things that are moving at scale. And unfortunately, the things that are moving at scale are often causing more harm to the people who are most directly negatively impacted. So that's a challenge, but I'll give you an example. Here in Austin, the city all of a sudden wants a return on its affordable housing bonds. This is like this week I found this out. So we've got some of our most prolific community development corporations going, wait a minute, I can't pay back this $2 million. This was supposed to be a deferred loan. Now all of a sudden the city wants back interest. So in the city of Houston, we had a community land trust. Their community land trust had $50 million allocated that is now getting reallocated to private developers to build workforce housing at 80 to 120% median family income. Very different from the homes subsidized by $150,000 to create equity and permanent affordability. So that's the pressure and the tension that we're feeling. And so from an economic standpoint, we got to find a way to make visible these externalized costs and also the benefits. I'm probably out of time. I have no sense.
No, you're good.
Okay. I was going to maybe go back. This is a lot of bullets you could look through. But, you know, these are questions we're asking. Because GAVA has been doing all this great work in healthy food access, physical activity. We're at the point now where we would really like to leverage a couple $1 million for our own capital stack. And whether it's developing new community development commission corporation, or working with our existing CDCs to acquire land or to preserve land, to buy out an apartment complex that can be held perpetually affordable, and to realize the health outcomes that we know. If the people are there and we're working together, we can realize these health outcomes. But if the people leave, we're doing it for Starbucks, or we're doing it for somebody else, right? Maybe Starbucks isn't a great example. They just closed downtown, but so there are some best practices. And somebody like GAVA, are we going to start building housing? I don't know, but we might work really well as a mission steward in a housing pipeline, which is to say, you start a deal, community wants all these things. By the time you get to the end of the deal and the finances, often those community benefits get penciled out. They're the sacrificial lamb at the end, like, oh, we can't do the park space, or the park space is going to be a drainage ditch. Statesman bud. Or, there won't be, they're only just going to do 4% affordability offsite. Statesman bud. But, those are the things that often get sacrificed. And so GAVA in a housing deal could play that mission steward role. Oh, I already went there, yeah. And then I'll just briefly touch on the work we're doing around climate resilience. So again, applying that community organizing methodology that we used for better playgrounds, better food sources, to get better drainage infrastructure. This is bringing the people out of their office, especially the engineers, and coming into the community and showing the state of things and walking it with the people who are experiencing flooding and erosion and all of those things. Having house meetings in Spanish with our engineers who happen to be bilinguals, pretty awesome. Matt Holland there in the center in the green shirt, he's now with Austin Water. He was with Watershed Protection for decades. Really, really smart guy. Also happens to speak excellent Mexican Spanish. I say Mexican because listening to him, like, you learned in Mexico. I'm giving these people your phone number. But this is in Francis Acuña's house, our organizer, so this is getting them to actually bring the maps, explain the stuff. And we started working on this when we found out about Atlas 14, which is our flood modeling being updated for the first time since the 1990s. 500-year floodplains, now the 100-year floodplain, et cetera. So when we found that out in 2018 from the Office of Sustainability, after I picked my job off of the clay pit dining table, I said, there's really not any way for us to ethically continue to organize without addressing this issue. We were here as 2 catastrophic floods hit, and we weren't doing anything about it. So let's start working on the drainage infrastructure, the disaster preparedness, and in our beautiful green spaces along the creek, we also used the environmental justice frame and climate justice frame as we worked with Professor Bjorn Sletto and his class on Williamson Creek, and actually using this very interactive, human-centered, conversational, and in-person process, of course, all through the pandemic, so you can see everybody's masked. Really beautiful, comprehensive community planning. I mean, I wish that this could just be a model for everyone in the city. It's a little idealistic. It's also centered around green space, not necessarily in housing development, but the process was just gold, and it was very, very meaningful. And one of the cool things I just want to highlight is the way that different generations perceive the green space. Risks, safety, beauty, connectivity, all of those things really varied, whether you're talking to the teenagers who are working with the Urban Roots South Austin internship, or the elders, people who had been there through high crime rates or through floods, versus people newer to the area, et cetera. So this practicum was really incredible, and there's a beautiful published piece, Donde corre el agua, where the water runs, that you can learn about from it. So these are some bright spots. Moral of the story, I guess, from everything I just spit out at y'all, is that the good stuff takes time. I think that's a Gandhi quote, that, but the bad things happen fast, and goodness moves at a snail's pace. And it's difficult because sometimes the progress we see, like something like the Think East PUD, has a history that goes back to the tank farm battles of the early 90s, which go back to the industrial overlay of the 1950s and go back to the 1928 master plan, right? But the people's movement to really change things that starts in the 90s is what paved the way for us to be able to do a community development deal that acknowledges that history. Similarly, this incredible, trail project that hopefully the city is going to be funding over the next few years takes into consideration who's been there, who's here now, who are we welcoming, and how do we make investments that will be used and actually bring us a return, whether that return is in immediate land value or just cost savings because we're healthier and happier and not starved for social programs, but have a community that holds each other up. So I'm going to stop there. I hope that was illuminating, kind of covered what I said in my abstract. And if we have any time, I'm totally open to questions.